So here we're going to go through chapter 19 through to 22 for the Rhetoric. And in the three chapters from 19 through to 22, Aristotle is going over arguments that are common to pretty much all orators or speakers, or arguments that he saw as being common to the majority of speakers of that time. And these arguments are to do with several themes or concepts. The first of these themes is the idea of possibility or probability. And he starts out by illustrating that we can argue something is more probable or is likely if something less likely than it but related to it exists. So if a species exists, then the genus exists of that species. So if dogs exist, then we can argue that the canine family exists. And if someone's forgotten something, then we can argue a priori that he had learnt it at some point. Or if the parts are possible, then the whole is possible. So if we see a wheel, we can say that there's definitely a vehicle that has been created for that wheel. And of course, all these arguments can be refuted, but they're compelling by their common sense-ness, for lack of a better term. The other tool of argumentation he uses is the idea of desire. If we can demonstrate that someone desires something, we can argue that they've done it. So if somebody desires to do something, we can argue that they've done it. If bad people desire something bad, then it's likely that they'll do that thing if they have the ability to do so. And good people desire good things and seek out to do the good. If the harder thing is possible, then the easier thing is definitely possible, or is certain. And if we see one pair of a contrary, then we can argue the other side of the contrary exists. So where there's ice, there's fire. And what's possible for the weak person is certainly possible for the able individual. So those are the arguments around possibility. And the other source of arguments are around time. So this is really arguments to do with causality. A fallacious argument is that if something's been attempted, then it's been done or carried out. Or if it's thundered, then it's light, and then there was lightning. And of course there are easy refutations for that. It may not have been thunder indeed, it may just have been an explosion or something else. Or where there's intent and there are no barriers, there is action. Looking ahead to the future, you can make similar arguments. The metaphor he uses here is the foundations of a house. So if we can demonstrate the foundations of a house have been laid, then we can argue that that house is going to be built in the future. Aristotle in these chapters also talks about magnitude, so size of things. We are questioning the greatness or smallness of something, or making something appear greater than it is or smaller than it is. And the argument he uses is around charity. So if someone's arguing that they're magnanimous, or if someone's arguing about the magnanimity or the charitable nature of another person, we can argue that actually maybe they were only doing it for their own good. Otherwise, why would it be public? Why didn't they do it in confidence? Or we can argue that that individual had a lot more than they were giving, and it may seem a large amount to us, but actually for them it's pittance. They aren't losing anything noticeable or anything significant, and vice versa. So those are 4 things: the possible and impossible, past fact, future fact, and magnitude. Aristotle then goes into enthymemes, and we've covered this, so I'm going to skip it. He ties these to maxims. So a maxim is not a fact, but a general statement, and it doesn't necessarily have a reason connected to it. And it often concerns matters that are practical. And his view is that you shouldn't really quote maxims unless you have authority, whether that authority comes from your age or from your experience. Young people in general shouldn't be quoted maxims because it makes them look arrogant or out of place or old-fashioned. Why is a maxim effective? It's a way of expressing something that people believe, but the belief they have is inchoate or unformed. They haven't necessarily articulated that belief. So when you say it for them, it feels as if they have discovered something about themselves, and that's something that's comforting and they relate to you. And it generalizes an experience that's particular to them. And the argument he gives is, if you're addressing people that, have been disturbed by terrible neighbours, you can talk about how bad it is to have bad neighbours, something like that, or you can give a maxim about that affliction, and then they'll agree with you. The purpose of maxims is to invest a speech with kind of a moral, timeless character. And to generalize a particular. Another thing he says is that you can contradict a maxim or a common belief, and that is more impressive because that shows you're an individual and it shows you're a critical thinker. Contradicting conventional wisdom is a way to gain esteem. So much for maxims. We'll move on to enthymemes in chapter 22, the way they were discussed. So as I said in the prior videos, these are syllogisms that are shortened. So they skip the reasoning or the logical steps, and the reason they do that is because it's more effective and it's just less boring to hear. They keep the pith of the argument and they discard all the hand-wavy reasoning and logic. Aristotle says you shouldn't labour over every point, and you should prepare ahead of time and have your arguments concise. And he also said there are false and true enthymemes in the same way that there are false and true syllogisms, or valid and sound logic. And the way you can demonstrate something is false is by contradicting the argument or showing a counterexample. In chapter 23, Aristotle gives 27 lines of argument, and these are manifold, so we won't go over all of them in this video. We'll go over them in the next video. The first one is inversion. So if we, example he gives is that licentiousness or greedy, lustful behaviour is harmful, therefore temperance is good. Or we can invert an event. So if people are suffering from a war, we can argue that surrendering is a solution because it will bring about peace. And of course, that may not be the optimal path to take, but there's something elegant or simplistic in saying that the opposite, in a sense, of the thing that's afflicting us is the solution. Then he has another quote, so if even evildoers should not anger us if they do not mean what they did, in the same token, do-gooders constrained to do so deserve no gratitude. So the argument here is that we should look at the intent of people's actions as opposed to the outcome to assess their moral culpability. The second is modification of key words. So drawing out the nuance of a word. So to do something justly doesn't necessarily mean it's beneficial to all involved. Justice may not be profitable. But there's a fortiori argument, so the argument from the stronger case. So if something doesn't exist where it should, where it's more likely to exist, then it definitely won't exist here. So if the gods aren't all-knowing, then humans certainly aren't. Or if Theseus did no wrong, neither did Paris. If generals aren't bad, then neither is Sophists, because both were sentenced to death frequently. They were wrongly sentenced to death in many cases. Then there's manipulating time. So the argument here is that if I'd asked you to reward me to do something before I did it, you would have agreed. Now I've done it, you haven't done so. So you're kind of highlighting inconsistency and an opportunism. So you're pretending the context is identical between the past and the present. Or you're using someone's principles against them. And then there's also the a fortiori of applying to the other speaker what he has said to yourself. So Socrates, in one story about him, refused to go to court to accept a benefit or like a prize, in a similar way that some people refuse to take Nobel Prizes and that type of thing. And he said his inability to requite the benefit is as bad as being unable to requite an injury. So he didn't want to accept it because he couldn't pay the person back in a sense. And then there's also equivocation. So you take all the senses of the word and you choose the sense that suits you. So the word rightly, it could be right by law, it could be right by custom, it could be right proportionally, it could be right by merit or justice, so it could be any of those things. So something could be legal, but it may not be right proportionally because the law is wrong to be sentenced to death for stealing, for example. And then there's false dichotomy. You can say all of X is caused by A, B, or C, or you can argue based on induction. And the argument here is about, they were talking about using mercenaries or using hiring people from other countries to do things. And he said we wouldn't handle our horses to people who mishandled others, so we wouldn't have handed our ships to people who have wrecked theirs. So why hand our security to these people? So it's basically saying if these people haven't, if they haven't been able to profitably do their business, why should they be able to do ours? It's an inductive argument. Then there's argument from precedent, so it's just appealing to the gods or authority. And then there's questioning, that's basically probing someone's statement. So if someone says the soul has motion, you'll ask them exactly what's moving here and how does it move. Another argument is emphasis. So you focus on negatives if you want to discourage, positives for encouraging and rational correspondence, which is taking some rational conclusion. So this is about the draft. So they were drafting all males above a certain height as men. So the argument was that if you count tall boys as men, does that mean that short men are boys? So it's contradictory there. It shows how ridiculous the rule is. Finally, it's the argument for motive or benefit. So you're arguing that something is more likely to have occurred because it would have benefited someone. Finally, you've got contradictions in the argument. That's self-explanatory. Drawing meanings from name, so nominative determinism. So looking at the name and then trying to say someone's acting in accordance to their name, or they're destined to act a certain way because of their name. Spurious arguments, which we've gone over. So for example, one of the examples was that in one of the Greek classic tales, a person was freed he was tied up with rope somewhere, he was trapped or held hostage, and then some mice chewed through the rope. And then the argument was that the gods destined him to be saved because the mice chewed through the rope, or that the mice were noble or something like that. And then, that's just, you can argue that wasn't the case. It could have been an accident, or that wasn't their motive, or how would they have known that this person was trapped? So he gave a fatalistic kind of destiny. He put the allure of destiny on the outcome when it could have just been happenstance on that. So another form of argument is drawing inferences from the part of the whole. So if you know every letter of the alphabet, you must know every word of the language, is obviously a flawed argument. Or if two portions of medicine are fatal, one portion must be bad as well. So these are fallacious arguments, and they come from not knowing the actual causal mechanisms by which a medicine will harm you or overdoses occur. So it's just poor reasoning without actually knowing what's happening. So using signs or cherry picking is one of the things. So correlation or causation, which I mentioned earlier with the mice, freeing the person. So the language that the mice actually freed the person implies that they knew the person was trapped and they wished to free them, but they're attributing motives to the consequence without knowing the cause. General and specific probabilities. So if something improbable happened, they argue that actually it was probable because improbable things are bound to happen, and probable things happen every day. But that's applying a general statement to a specific thing, which is fallacious. And then there's refuting the enthymemes, so objections to the argument, disanalogy, so showing a case or an example where it doesn't apply, and then counter-reasoning, so refuting it analytically. So that's where we'll stop here, and we'll go through the rest in the next video, and then we'll decide what to do after this, what book to study after this. Thank you.